how do we learn? I mean, really, how does it all work? It sounds like such a simple question, right? But the answer? Well, it's actually pretty complex. So today, we're going to take a tour of the 5 major theories in educational psychology to really get a handle on the fascinating science behind how knowledge gets into our brains.
All right, here's our game plan. We'll start with that one central question, and then we're going to explore 5 totally different answers: behaviorism, cognitivism, developmentalism, social cognition, and finally, constructivism. Let's get right into it.
So, let's start with the big one. How do we actually learn? It turns out there isn't just one single simple answer. Instead, what psychologists have given us are several really powerful frameworks for thinking about it. To help us keep all these ideas straight, we're going to use a metaphor for this whole explainer, the learning tree. Just imagine that each of these 5 perspectives is like a major branch growing from the same trunk. They're all trying to explain the exact same thing, learning, but they're coming at it from completely different angles. Okay, our first branch is behaviorism. You can think of this as the show me, don't tell me school of thought. Behaviorists, they're not all that interested in what you're thinking or feeling. Nope, they care about what you do, the stuff we can actually see and measure. So at its core, behaviorism is all about stimulus and response, right? You've heard of Pavlov's dog hearing a bell, that's the stimulus, and then it starts to drool because it's expecting food. That's the response. For a behaviorist, learning is just forging that link between some external event and an observable action. Simple as that. Now, this perspective plays by some pretty strict rules. Behaviorists believe our environment is everything. It just shapes us with rewards and punishments. And for them, if you can't physically see a change in someone's behavior, then no learning has actually happened. And get this, they basically believed that the way a rat learns a maze isn't fundamentally different from how a person learns a new language. And the main guy you need to connect with this branch is John Watson. He's known as the father of behaviorism, the one who really hammered home this idea of only focusing on what could be seen and measured. But hang on, behaviorism leaves a huge question unanswered. What about everything that's happening inside our heads? See, behaviorism just flat out ignores our thoughts and feelings, treating the mind like this unknowable black box. And that black box is exactly what our next perspective is dying to crack open.
So let's climb up to our second branch, cognitivism. If behaviorism was all about the outside, well, cognitivism is all about the inside. This is the deep dive into that so-called black box, exploring all the mental gymnastics that the behaviorists just ignored. Cognitive psychology shifts the focus to things like memory, perception, and problem solving. A great way to think about it is that the brain is like a computer. It's not just about the input and the output. Cognitivists want to understand the software. How is information being processed, filed away, and then retrieved later? It's all about what the mind does with information. And you really can't talk about cognitivism without mentioning the great Jean Piaget. His big breakthrough was realizing that our mental software isn't static. It gets some major upgrades as we grow up. He showed that a child's mind literally works in a fundamentally different way than an adult's, which is the perfect setup for our third branch. And that idea of change over time brings us right to our third branch, developmentalism. This perspective introduces the super important variable of time. The core idea is simple, really. You can't understand how someone learns without knowing when in their life that learning is happening. See, developmentalists don't see learning as just one thing, but as this lifelong journey. They study how we change and grow as learners, from the time we're babies all the way through old age. It's about how learning itself evolves as we evolve. Okay, so we've looked at external actions, internal thoughts, and the timeline of learning. But we don't learn in a bubble, right? We learn from and with other people. And that brings us to our fourth branch, social cognition, which zooms out to look at how we learn from each other. The big idea here is something we all know intuitively. We learn a ton just by watching other people. I mean, think about it. How did you learn to tie your shoes, or ride a bike, or even just how to act in a new social situation? Chances are you watch somebody else do it first. That's social cognitive theory right there. Now, here's what's really key. Unlike behaviorism, social cognitivists say you can learn something just by watching, even if you don't immediately change your behavior. The learning can be totally internal. You just kind of store that information away for a rainy day. The architect of this whole perspective is Albert Bandura. You might have heard of his famous Bobo doll experiment.
It showed pretty powerfully that kids could learn aggressive behavior just by watching an adult. It was a huge moment for social learning theory. And that brings us to our fifth and final branch, constructivism. Now, this perspective makes a pretty radical shift. It puts you, the learner, right at the center of the whole process. You're not just a passive sponge soaking up information. You're an active builder of your own knowledge. Here's the main idea. Learning isn't about filling up an empty bucket with facts. Constructivists see it as being more like building something with Legos. You get these new pieces of information, but you use your own past experiences and beliefs to actively construct a unique understanding that's all your own. This really paints a modern picture of what it means to be a learner. In this model, you're in the driver's seat. You're self-directed, creative, and you take the primary responsibility for your own learning. The teacher becomes more of a guide, and learning often happens best when we work together to build that knowledge. Okay, let's pull all the way back and look at our whole learning tree. This table wraps it up perfectly. We started with behaviorism and its focus on what we can see. Then we dove inside the mind with cognitivism. We added the element of time with developmentalism, zoomed out to see how we learn from others with social cognition, and finally, we landed on constructivism, which puts you in charge of building your own knowledge. 5 different branches, all explaining the same amazing process. So, I'll leave you with this question. After our little tour of these 5 perspectives, which one feels the most true for you? Think about something important you've learned. Was it all about practice and reward? Did you learn it by watching an expert, or was it about you actively piecing it all together? The truth, of course, is that we're probably a blend of all of them. Thanks so much for joining me.
We all learn something new every single day. But have you ever, really stopped to think about how that happens? What's actually going on in there? Well, today we're going to get into it.
I mean, on the surface, it seems pretty simple, right? But if you really think about it, taking in new info, trying to make sense of it, and then, tucking it away somewhere in your brain, that's actually super complex. So what is going on in our heads when we have one of those aha moments?
So, to figure this out, we're going to use this really cool metaphor, a tree of knowledge. Just imagine educational psychology is this big tree, and it's got 5 main branches. Each one gives us a totally different way of looking at how we learn. So, let's start climbing, shall we? Okay, so our first branch, is all about behavior. Now, this perspective, it's not really interested in what's going on inside your head. Nope, it's focused purely on what we can actually see, your actions.
And the core idea here is actually pretty simple. Behaviorists basically see learning as a relationship between some kind of trigger from the outside world, they call that a stimulus, and our reaction to it, which is the response. It's almost like a simple cause and effect for everything we do.
And here's the kicker for behaviorists. If you can't see it, it doesn't count. Seriously, from their point of view, learning has only truly happened if there's a visible, observable change in behavior. Think about teaching a dog to sit, right? You give the command, that's the stimulus. The dog sits, that's the response. And then you give it a treat, the reward. That observable loop is what matters.
The main guy behind this whole school of thought was John Watson. He's the one who really set the stage for focusing only on what's happening on the outside. But, as you can probably guess, not everyone was on board with completely ignoring our inner world. And that, right there, leads us to this huge shift in thinking. Because while behaviorism was laser-focused on the outside, this whole new perspective popped up, and it decided to do the exact opposite, to crack open what they called the black box of the mind and really explore what's going on inside. So, let's climb up to our next branch and see how this all connects. This is the cognitive perspective, and its main argument is that the most important part of learning is the very thing behaviorism completely ignored, all those internal mental processes. Yeah, so if behaviorism is all about our actions, you can think of cognitive psychology as being all about the brain's software. It's fascinated with how we perceive the world around us, how our memory actually works, how we solve problems, and, of course, how we use language. This is the theory that brought things like belief, desire, and motivation back into the conversation. The big idea here is that our brain isn't just some passive sponge soaking up information. Nope. Our memories and everything we already know, they act like a filter, shaping how we see and interpret every new thing we encounter. It's all about that super important mental step that happens between seeing something and actually reacting to it. And this whole field was really shaped by some heavy hitters, like Jean Piaget.
He's the one who showed how kids' thinking develops in these distinct stages, and also Lev Vygotsky, who pointed out just how much we learn from interacting and collaborating with other people.
And you know that whole idea of development, it leads us perfectly to our third branch. So now let's kind of zoom out and add the element of time to the mix, because let's face it, how we learn isn't some fixed thing. It changes a lot throughout our lives.
This is where developmental psychology comes in. It's all about the big picture. It studies the changes that happen to us as learners over our entire lifespan. I'm talking from when we're babies all the way to being adults. It's all about exploring how our ability to learn grows and completely transforms over time.
Now, there's a pretty big debate in this field. Is our development discontinuous or continuous? So discontinuous theories argue that we learn in these very clear, separate stages, kind of like climbing a ladder, one rung at a time. On the other hand, continuous theories say it's more like a smooth ramp, just this gradual, ongoing process of change.
Some of the key thinkers here. You've got Erik Erikson, who famously mapped out our psychosocial development into 8 stages. And then there's Lawrence Kohlberg, who's really focused on how our moral compass, our moral reasoning develops over time. They basically gave us a kind of roadmap for this whole journey of learning. Okay, so let's recap. We've looked at the world outside of us, the world inside our heads, and the whole element of time. But here's the thing. Our tree of knowledge doesn't just grow in a vacuum, right? It's part of this big, interconnected social forest. And that is exactly where our last 2 perspectives come into play. First up, we have the social cognitive theory. And this one feels so intuitive, you know? It basically says that one of the most powerful ways we learn is just by watching other people. Simple as that. We observe, we imitate, and we learn.
The big name here is Albert Bandura, and his theory points out that learning can be a totally internal thing. You can literally watch someone do something and learn how to do it without ever trying it yourself. We also learn by watching what happens to other people. Like, if someone gets rewarded for something, we're probably going to be more likely to copy them.
And that brings us to our 5th and final branch, the constructivist theory. Now, this perspective has what was a pretty revolutionary idea at the time. We are not empty buckets or sponges just waiting for knowledge to be poured into us. No. Instead, we are active builders.
In this view, which was pioneered by great thinkers like Maria Montessori, the learner, well, you're the star of the show. We actively construct our own understanding by connecting new things we experience to our background, our culture, our whole worldview. So the teacher isn't just a lecturer spewing facts. They're more of a guide, a facilitator. And learning with other people is absolutely key to building that knowledge.
All right, let's take a step back from all the individual branches for a second and just take in the full view of our tree. We've just looked at 5 really powerful lenses, and they're all looking at the exact same thing, learning, but from totally different angles.
And this really brings us to the most important takeaway. There isn't just one single correct theory of learning. The real truth is, every single one of these branches, these perspectives, gives us valuable insights into how this absolutely amazing process works.
So let's just boil this all down one more time, nice and simple. Behaviorism, it's all about action. Cognitivism, that's all about thought. Developmentalism is about how we change over time. Social cognitive theory is about learning from others. And constructivism, well, that one puts you, the learner, right in the driver's seat. So I'm going to leave you with this question. Just think about the last time you learned something really new. I mean, really learned it. Which one of these theories, or which combination, best explains how it happened for you? Was it trial and error? Was it just deep, quiet thought? Was it watching an expert? Or was it you, actively building your own understanding piece by piece? The answer, when you really think about it, is probably a little bit of all of them. All right, today we're jumping into a school of thought that completely changed psychology. It's called behaviorism, and it tried to make the study of the mind a real, objective science by focusing on one simple thing, what we can actually see people do. But first, let me ask you something. Why do you automatically reach for your phone the second you feel bored? Or follow the exact same routine every single morning? Or, feel that little jolt of anxiety in certain situations? Well, the behaviorist would say the answer is way simpler than you think. So to really get what behaviorism is all about, we got to go back to the early 20th century. Psychology was the new kid on the block, and frankly, it had a bit of an image problem. It wanted to be a serious science, but it was built on stuff you can't see or measure, like people's private feelings and thoughts.
And this slide, this is where everything changes. The old way of doing things, called introspection, was basically asking someone to describe their inner experience. It's like trying to scientifically measure how I see the color red versus how you see it. It's totally personal, you can't verify it. Behaviorism crashed the party and said, hey, let's forget what's inside the head for a second and just focus on the actions, the stuff we can all see and agree on.
And this is the core idea, right here. For a true behaviorist, psychology isn't about the mind or feelings. It's about stimulus and response, what happens in the environment, and what action does that cause. That's it. They treated the mind like a black box. You don't need to know what's going on inside to understand the inputs and the outputs.
So this leads to a really radical idea. We're all born as blank slates, or tabula rasa. Everything we become, our quirks, our fears, our talents, is learned through our interactions with the world around us. For them, your environment is everything.
Okay, so if the environment shapes us, how does that actually work? Well, the first big piece of the puzzle is learning through simple association. And that brings us to, of all things, a dog.
Yeah, our story starts kind of funny enough, not in a psychology lab, but with a physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. This guy wasn't trying to unlock the secrets of the mind. He was just studying dog drool, of all things, when he noticed something odd.
And this slide just lays out his amazing discovery perfectly. It's a super simple 3-step dance. Step 1, you've got a natural reflex, right? Food makes a dog drool. Duh. Then, Pavlov starts ringing a bell right before he brings out the food, over and over again. Bell, then food. Bell, then food. Finally, and this is the magic part, the dog's brain makes a new connection. Just the sound of the bell, no food in sight, is enough to make it start drooling. A new behavior has been learned. It's been conditioned.
And that process got a name: classical conditioning. It's just learning by association, and you do it all the time. Ever get hungry just because the clock strikes noon? Or feel a sudden wave of calm when you hear a song from your childhood? Yep, that's classical conditioning working on you.
Okay, so if Pavlov cracked the door open, this American psychologist named John B. Watson kicked it right off its hinges. He became the biggest cheerleader for behaviorism and made this incredibly wild claim. Give me a dozen healthy infants, and I can shape them into anything. A doctor, a lawyer, even a thief, just by controlling their environment.
And to prove it, he did the now famous and, let's be honest, super unethical little Albert experiment. He taught a baby boy to be terrified of a harmless white rat just by banging a steel bar loudly behind the baby's head every time he saw it. And the big takeaway? Even something as deep and complex as fear wasn't born in us. It could be learned, conditioned right into us by our experiences.
But wait, learning isn't just about linking two things together, like a bell and food. We also learn from the results of what we do. And this brings us to the second massive pillar of behaviorism, the power of consequences.
And the foundation for this is Edward Thorndike's law of effect. I mean, it's so intuitive it almost sounds obvious. If you do something and a good thing happens, you're probably going to do it again. If a bad thing happens, you're less likely. Simple, right? But this super simple idea became the launchpad for a much, much bigger theory.
And the guy who built that theory was maybe the most famous behaviorist of all time, B.F. Skinner. He took that law of effect and turned it into a hardcore science. He created controlled environments, like the famous Skinner box, to measure exactly how rewards and punishments could shape the behavior of animals with incredible precision.
Skinner's whole system really boils down to this key difference right here. Reinforcement, and that can be getting something good, like a treat, or having something bad taken away, like an annoying noise, always strengthens a behavior. It makes it more likely to happen again. Punishment, on the other hand, does the opposite. It weakens a behavior, making you less likely to do it again.
But here it is. This is Skinner's most mind-blowing insight. The absolute best way to lock a behavior in for good? Give out rewards, but do it unpredictably. Think about a slot machine. Or more to the point, think about refreshing your social media feed. You don't get a great post every time, but the chance that you might get one is what makes you pull that lever again and again and again. It's powerfully addictive.
Okay, so all this might just sound like old experiments with rats and pigeons, but I promise you, these principles are everywhere. They are running in the background of our modern lives. Let's take a look at how this stuff is used out in the real world.
You see it everywhere once you know what to look for. It's the gold stars in the classroom that reward good work. It's in therapies that help people systematically face and overcome their deepest fears. It's the performance bonus at your job that pushes you to hit your targets. And oh yeah, it's all over your phone, in every app that uses points and badges to keep you coming back for more.
I mean, just think about a language learning app.
You get an answer right, you get a little shower of points, a satisfying ding sound, maybe you unlock a new badge. That's pure positive reinforcement. It's designed very intentionally to strengthen your study habit. It is literally B.F. Skinner's lab right there in your pocket.
So you might be thinking, if behaviorism is so powerful and explains so much, why isn't it the only game in town in psychology today? Well, the story didn't just stop there. It got more complicated, and it evolved. The biggest knock against behaviorism was that whole black box idea. It just completely ignored thoughts, feelings, memories, all the stuff happening inside our heads. So by the 1960s, a new movement, the cognitive revolution, came along and said, whoa, hold on. You can't possibly understand why people do what they do if you don't study the mental processes that are driving the behavior. The focus shifted back inside the mind.
But here's the really important part. Behaviorism wasn't just tossed in the trash. Not at all. Its principles were folded in, refined, and built upon. A perfect modern example is something called applied behavior analysis, or ABA. It's one of the most effective therapies for children with autism, and it uses systematic reinforcement to teach all sorts of crucial life skills. It's proof of the lasting power of Skinner's work.
So this timeline really wraps the whole story up nicely, doesn't it? It starts with Pavlov and his dog stumbling onto classical conditioning. Then it gets supercharged by Skinner, who turns consequences into a science. It gets challenged by the cognitive revolution, which demanded we look inside the mind. And it all lands right here, today, embedded in the therapies and the tech we use every single day. Behaviorism gave us the ground rules for how experience shapes action.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Now that you know the rules of the game, conditioning and reinforcement, take a look at your own life. That first cup of coffee in the morning, the way you scroll through your phone, the route you take to work. What's one routine you have that's secretly being guided by rewards and consequences you might not have even noticed before?
Have you ever stopped and wondered where your habits come from? Or your fears? What about the things you love? Well, today we're diving into behaviorism. It's the school of psychology that basically said, yep, we can explain all of that. It tried to turn the whole messy business of being human into a predictable science. And believe me, it's a wild story, full of drooling dogs, a surprisingly fearless baby, and some very clever pigeons. This right here, this is the big question. It's the challenge that behaviorism threw down. Could everything we do, from what we eat for breakfast to who we fall in love with, be boiled down to a science? Could it be predicted and even controlled? The behaviorists didn't just think so. They were dead set on proving it. So let's see how they did it. Okay, so to really get why behaviorism was such a huge deal, you gotta understand what psychology was like before it came along. Back in the early days, psychology was seen as kind of, well, a soft science. It felt more like philosophy than something you do in a lab. It was all about introspection, asking people what they were thinking and feeling. So on one hand, you had early psychology trying to map out this invisible internal world of thoughts and emotions. But the behaviorist came along and said, hang on, how do you scientifically measure a feeling? You can't, right? So their solution was pretty radical. They said, let's just ignore the black box of the mind completely. We're only going to focus on what we can see and measure. A stimulus goes in, a response comes out. Simple as that. And this whole scientific revolution starts in a really weird place. Not in a psychology department, but with a scientist who was studying how dogs digest their food. This is where we meet our first major player, Ivan Pavlov. So Pavlov wasn't even a psychologist. His main gig was studying the digestive system. But he kept noticing this weird thing happening. His lab dogs would start drooling before they even got their food. The sound of his assistant's footsteps coming down the hall was enough to set them off. He realized, wait a minute, this isn't just about digestion. Something else, something really profound is going on here. So he set up his now legendary experiment. Let's walk through it. In step 1, you ring a bell. To the dog, it means nothing, no drool. In step 2, you show the dog food. It drools. That's a natural, unlearned reflex. Now, here's where the magic happens. In step 3, you start ringing the bell right before you bring out the food, over and over again. You're building an association. And pretty soon, you get to step 4. Now, the sound of the bell by itself is enough to make the dog salivate. He had literally conditioned a new reflex. And what Pavlov had discovered is what we now call classical conditioning. It's a really simple but incredibly powerful idea. We learn through association. You take something neutral, like a sound, and you pair it with something meaningful, like food, and eventually that neutral thing starts to trigger the exact same response all on its own.
So Pavlov lays all this amazing scientific groundwork over in Russia, but it's an ambitious, outspoken American psychologist who takes these ideas and turns them into a full-blown movement. It's time to meet John B. Watson. In 1913, Watson drops a bombshell on the world of psychology. He publishes what everyone starts calling the Behaviorist Manifesto. And in it, he argues that psychology needs to completely throw out everything about the mind, consciousness, feelings, all of it. He says the only thing that should matter to a real science of psychology is observable behavior.
And Watson, well, he was not a subtle guy. This quote right here shows you just how radical he was. He truly believed that the environment was everything. For him, nurture wasn't just part of the story, it was the whole story. Your genes, your natural talents, he thought they were pretty much irrelevant. With the right conditioning, he claimed he could turn any baby into anything at all.
And to prove his point, he conducted the now infamous and very ethically questionable Little Albert experiment. He took a baby who loved playing with a little white rat. Then, Watson started making this horrible, loud clanging noise behind the baby's head every time the rat was brought out. And pretty soon, just the sight of the white rat was enough to make little Albert burst into tears. Watson had shown that even a powerful emotion like fear could be learned through conditioning. This timeline really lays out the journey for us. It all kicks off with Pavlov's accidental discovery back in the 1890s. Then Watson comes along in 1913 and turns it into a movement. Next up, we'll talk about B.F. Skinner, who took these ideas to a whole new level. And finally, we'll see how it all got challenged by something called the cognitive revolution. All right, now we get to B.F. Skinner. You could say that if Watson was the guy who wrote the fiery Declaration of Independence for behaviorism, Skinner was the genius who designed the whole system of government. He refined the ideas and took them one giant step further. Skinner's big breakthrough was to shift the focus. He said it's not just about what happens before a behavior, like Pavlov's bell. The real power lies in what happens after. The consequences of an action, he argued, are the single most important factor in shaping what we do next.
And this idea is the heart of his most famous concept, operant conditioning. It sounds technical, but it's incredibly simple. If a behavior is followed by something good, a reward, or a reinforcer, you're more likely to do it again. If it's followed by something bad, a punishment, you're less likely to do it again. This wasn't just about involuntary reflexes anymore. This was about explaining our choices. To study this, he invented the famous, or infamous, Skinner box. Inside this little chamber, an animal, like a rat, could press a lever to get a food pellet. By carefully controlling how and when those rewards were delivered, Skinner could teach these animals to do some surprisingly complex things. He was, in a very real sense, engineering their behavior.
This slide really clarifies the big leap forward. You see, Watson was mostly focused on prediction. If I show you this stimulus, I can predict you'll have this response. But Skinner took it to the next level. He was focused on control. By manipulating the consequences, I can actively shape your future actions. It's a huge shift from just predicting behavior to actively engineering it. So for decades, behaviorism was the undisputed champion of psychology. It dominated the field. But its reign couldn't last forever. So what happened? And more importantly, what parts of this powerful idea are still quietly shaping our world today? The cracks really started to show in the 1950s. This is when the cognitive revolution began. Thinkers like the linguist Noam Chomsky pointed out a massive hole in behaviorism. It just couldn't explain something as creative and complex as language. I mean, kids say all sorts of things they've never heard before and have never been rewarded for saying. Chomsky argued there had to be something more going on inside that black box of the mind. And that argument opened the door for psychology to start studying the mind again. This chart gives us a great little summary of the whole journey. You have Pavlov starting it all off with his work on reflexes. Then you see Thorndike, whose law of effect was a huge stepping stone. He was the first to really say that actions with good outcomes get repeated. Watson then took these ideas and applied them to all human behavior. And finally, Skinner came along and created this incredibly sophisticated system for controlling behavior through reinforcement. Now, don't make the mistake of thinking behaviorism is just some dusty old theory. Its ideas are literally all around us. You know the little reward notifications your phone gives you to keep you scrolling? That's pure operant conditioning. The most effective forms of therapy, like CBT, modern classroom techniques, video games, even animal training, they all use these core behaviorist principles every single day. So at the end of the day, even though behaviorism isn't the dominant theory in psychology anymore, its most important legacy is permanent. It's the movement that forced psychology to grow up and become a real, objective experimental science. Its demand for hard data and measurable results is now just how psychology is done.
And that leaves us with one final, really important question for our own lives. The behaviorists argued that our environment, with all its hidden rewards and punishments, is what makes us who we are. Well, today, a huge part of our environment is digital. It's built by algorithms designed specifically to capture our attention and shape our actions, which forces us to ask a critical question. If our environment is shaping us more powerfully than ever before, who or what is shaping our environment?
You know, in psychology, some words aren't just words. They're like little time capsules packed with hidden stories that tell you everything you need to know about a theory. Today, we're going to crack the code on one of the biggest ones out there, behaviorism.
So let's start with the crazy thought. What if the most famous words in psychology are actually hiding ancient secrets? What if they're like linguistic fossils, preserving the very first ideas about why we do what we do? Well, that's exactly what we're here to find out. We're going to go on a little archaeological dig through language.
And to understand this secret language, you gotta start at the beginning, with the name of the theory itself. Seriously, just by breaking down the word behaviorism, we can uncover the core idea that completely shook up the world of psychology.
Okay, so first, let's just look at that little ending, ism. It comes from Greek, and it's basically a flag that says, hey, pay attention. This is a whole system of thought, a complete philosophy. So when John B. Watson came up with behaviorism, he wasn't just suggesting an idea, he was planting a flag, declaring a brand new way of seeing the world. Now for the main event, the word behavior. This is so cool. It actually comes from an Old English word, haben, which means to have or to hold. So to behave literally meant to hold yourself in a particular way for someone to see. I mean, how perfect is that? The word itself describes the entire goal of the movement, to only study what you could see, measure, and, well, hold up to the light.
Right, so if behavior is something we can observe, how did the behaviorists actually explain it? Well, they built their entire theory on just two main pillars. This really simple, back and forth, a kind of call and answer between us and the world around us.
And those pillars are words you've definitely heard before, stimulus and response. The easiest way to think about it is like a conversation. The environment makes a call, that's the stimulus, and the organism gives an answer, that's the response. This simple little pair is the linguistic skeleton for the whole shebang.
Now, the origin of the word stimulus is just fantastic. In ancient Rome, a stimulus was a pointed stick, a goad, that they used to prod cattle and get them moving. And that really physical sense of being prodded is still baked right into the word. The environment doesn't just gently suggest something, no, it drives our behavior.
So what's the other side of that conversation? The response. This comes from the Latin respondere, which means to answer or to reply. So you see, a response isn't just some random thing that happens. It's a direct answer to that stimulus, which perfectly completes that call and answer loop.
Okay, so we've got the basic pillars, the stimulus and the response. But how does that simple pairing become something complex, like a learned behavior or a habit? Well, the next set of words we're going to look at reveals the actual architecture of learning, how our actions are built up, strengthened, and basically made to last.
First up is conditioning. Now, its Latin root conditio actually means an agreement or the terms of a deal. So you can think of conditioning as the process where our body makes a kind of conditional agreement with the world. For Pavlov's dogs, the terms of the deal were super simple. If this bell rings, then food shows up. An agreement was formed.
This next word, reinforcement, is great because it was literally borrowed from architecture. It means to make strong again. So when B.F. Skinner picked this word, he knew exactly what he was doing. He meant that a consequence makes a behavior stronger and more stable, just like putting steel rebar inside concrete reinforces the whole building.
And get this, reinforcement is part of a whole family of words that are all about strength. Words like fortify, fortress, force, even comfort. They all share that Latin root fortis, which means strong. So this wasn't some random word choice. It was picked specifically for its deep connection to building things that are tough and durable.
Okay, what about a habit? The original Latin word, habitus, meant clothing or what you wear. And I just love this metaphor. A habit is a behavior that we've worn so many times that it's basically become a part of us. It's like an automatic outfit that shapes what we do without us even having to think about it.
And here is where it all comes full circle. This is amazing. Habit, and our very first word, behavior, actually share the same linguistic DNA. They both go all the way back to that Latin root habere, to have or to hold. So having a habit is directly linguistically tied to holding yourself in a certain behavior. The language itself shows us they're two sides of the very same coin.
And just as a quick kind of mind-blowing aside, even the founders' names seem to fit the theory perfectly. Pavlov's name comes from a Latin word for small, and he focused on small observable changes. Watson's name is linked to a word for rule, and he wanted to create new rules for psychology. And Skinner's name? It's like someone who prepares animal skins, who works on the surface, just like he focused on the observable surface of behavior. I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Okay, so let's put all these pieces together. What's the secret code that we've just uncovered? When you look at where all these words come from stimulus to reinforcement to habit, a really clear pattern starts to emerge, and it reveals the deep philosophy at the heart of behaviorism.
The secret language of behaviorism is, at its core, concrete and physical. It talks about cattle prods and fortresses, about holding yourself and wearing your actions like clothing. It's a language all about the external world. It's about doing, not about internal feeling. It's all about motion and structure, things we can actually see and measure.
So here's the bottom line, the most crucial point of all. The vocabulary perfectly mirrors the philosophy. Behaviorism as a science threw out all the abstract guessing about what's going on inside the mind. And its language does the exact same thing. It is, quite literally, the language of the body in motion.
So what's the legacy of all this? Well, this secret language didn't stay in the lab. Today, we all use it all the time. Athletes talk about their conditioning. Your boss talks about positive reinforcement. And we all talk about building good habits. These words, born from ancient roots and tested in psychology labs, now shape the very way we talk about our own actions.
Understanding where these words come from really shows you their power, because they are all around us. So I'll leave you with this thought. Now that you're in on the secret, now that you know the code, where do you see the language of behaviorism at work in your world?
All right, today we're going to dive into a psychological theory from way back in the early 1900s that, believe it or not, secretly runs everything from your favorite apps to your daily habits. It's called behaviorism, and its story is just this fascinating journey from a really radical idea to an absolutely essential part of our modern lives.
So let me just start with this question. What if the apps on your phone, the way you learn new things, even your path to a better mood, what if all of that is being guided by a theory that's over 100 years old? It sounds kind of crazy, right? But as you're about to see, it's a lot closer to the truth than you might think.
You know, to really get behaviorism, you have to see it for what it was, a full-on rebellion. Back in the day, psychology was, well, it was full of introspection and kind of fuzzy ideas about the mind. The founders of behaviorism, they wanted absolutely none of that. They were aiming for a hard science, something precise, something predictable, something you could actually observe.
And the guy who lit the fuse on this whole thing was John B. Watson. In 1913, he published what was basically a declaration of war on the old way of thinking. His argument was super simple. If you can't see it and you can't measure it, it has no place in scientific psychology. So forget about thoughts and feelings. The only thing that mattered was behavior you could see with your own two eyes. Now, this was a pretty radical idea, but it didn't just stay an idea for long. It got backed up by some truly groundbreaking experiments. And these experiments showed that learning wasn't some mysterious internal thing, but something that could be systematically shaped by the world around us. So, first up, you've probably heard of this one, Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs. This is classical conditioning. The idea is so simple, but it's also profound. You take a neutral stimulus, like a bell, and you pair it with a natural stimulus, like food. And you do that enough times until the bell all by itself triggers the natural response, drooling. It's learning through a completely involuntary association.
Then, B.F. Skinner came along and took things a big step further with what he called operant conditioning. Now, this was different because it focused on voluntary behavior. Think of a pigeon learning to press a lever. Why does it do it? Because that action is followed by a reward. This simple idea that our actions are shaped by what happens after them would go on to dominate psychology for decades.
So let's just quickly break down the key difference here because it's important. With classical conditioning, it's all about involuntary reflexes. The learner is totally passive in the process. But with operant conditioning, the learner is an active participant. Their choices, their actions are directly shaped by the consequences that follow. It's really the difference between a reflex and a choice.
So for a while there, it really seemed like behaviorism had all the answers. I mean, Skinner was even talking about engineering a better society through what he called behavioral technology. But then things started to change. So what happened? Did behaviorism just kind of fizzle out and disappear?
Not at all. As you can see from this timeline, its journey was just getting interesting. So you had Watson's manifesto, then Skinner's total dominance, but then the 1970s brought something called the cognitive revolution. And all of a sudden, psychologists were insisting that, hey, thoughts, memory, our internal world, all that stuff does matter. It was a huge shift, and it definitely knocked behaviorism off its throne.
But here's the really crucial point. It didn't vanish. Instead, its super powerful tools were integrated into a much more complete picture of the human mind. So today, behaviorism works right alongside cognitive, emotional, and biological models. It's not the whole story anymore, but it's an absolutely vital chapter. And that brings us to today. So where do we actually see these century-old ideas at work in 2025? Well, the answer is pretty much everywhere. It's become this incredibly practical toolkit for change.
I mean, just look at how diverse these applications are. We see it in incredibly effective therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy and applied behavior analysis, or ABA, which is a huge deal for teaching new skills and supporting individuals with autism. We see it in how educational software is built, how we treat addiction, even how neuroscientists map out the brain's reward circuits. And oh yeah, the apps on your phone are absolutely packed with these principles.
Let's take cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as the perfect example of this integration. CBT helps people identify and challenge their negative thoughts, for sure. But it doesn't stop there. A huge part of it is actively changing your behavior, taking small, rewarding actions, which then helps alter your emotions. It's this perfect blend of cognitive work and behavioral work.
And what about your phone? You know that learning app that gives you badges and celebrates your streak? That is pure Skinner. It's using something called a reinforcement schedule, basically a specific pattern of rewards to keep you motivated and coming back for more. It's behavioral technology, and it's right there in your pocket.
So look, this isn't just about how others can influence behavior. I think the most powerful modern application of behaviorism is how we can use its principles for ourselves. It's a really cool shift from external control to personal empowerment. Now, we have to be fair here. The strengths are pretty obvious. It's clear, it's effective, and you can actually measure the results. But the limitations are real too. Focusing only on behavior can mean ignoring our rich inner lives, and if you overuse external rewards, you can actually kill the simple joy of doing something for its own sake.
But if there's one modern insight to take away from all of this, it's this right here. We usually assume we have to feel motivated before we can act. Modern therapy, using these amazing behaviorist tools, completely flips that script. It teaches us that action can actually come first. Your behavior can lead your mood, not just the other way around.
This really says it all, doesn't it? If you're always waiting for motivation to strike, you could be waiting a very long time. The big practical takeaway is that the path to feeling better often starts with the simple act of doing something, even if it's really, really small.
So, the legacy of behaviorism today isn't about controlling pigeons in a box. It's about this profound recognition that what we do, day in and day out, truly shapes who we are and how we feel. It's the understanding that small, consistent actions have the power to completely transform our experience.
Hey everyone, today we're digging into Atomic Habits. You know, that monster bestseller? We're going to pull back the curtain and see the powerful, century-old science that actually makes it tick.
Okay, let's kick things off with this quote from the book because honestly, it's the key to the whole thing. It's not about gritting your teeth and trying harder. No. The secret, it's all about building better systems.
And right here, this is the big secret we're going to unpack. See, Atomic Habits isn't some brand new magical life hack. It's actually a brilliant, super accessible translation of classic behavioral psychology. You know, the actual science of how our behaviors get wired into us.
All right, so let's get into it. What is this connection between this super popular book and some old school science? Well, it boils down to this really powerful idea. Real, lasting change, it has almost nothing to do with willpower. It's all about designing your world to make tiny, consistent actions almost effortless. And you know what's wild? James Clear and these pioneers of behaviorism like B.F. Skinner, they were decades apart, but they came to the exact same conclusion. It's that behaviors that get reinforced again and again, they just become automatic. And over time, those tiny automatic habits, they literally build who we are. Okay, so how does this actually work inside our heads? Let's break down the engine behind every single thing we do, what Clear calls the habit loop. So Clear says every single habit, and I mean everything, from pouring that first cup of coffee to mindlessly scrolling through your phone, it all follows these 4 simple steps. You got a trigger, that little nudge, that sparks a craving, which leads to you actually doing the thing, and then you get a reward that basically tells your brain, ooh, that was good, let's remember to do that again. And check this out. Here's the direct scientific connection. Clear's loop maps perfectly onto the classic model from psychology. Stimulus, response, reinforcement. It's literally the same powerful process, just with friendlier, more modern language. Okay, that's the what. Now for the how. How do we take control of this loop, right? How do we build the good habits and ditch the bad ones? Well, Clear gives us 4 laws, and every single one is a practical, hands-on way to apply this science. First up, law number 1, make it obvious. This one is all about that first step, the cue, or what scientists would call the stimulus. The whole idea is to set up your environment so the right behaviors are just the default. They happen automatically without you even having to think about it. So, for example, think about a student, let's call her Sophia. She had a really tough time getting herself to read for class. So she came up with this simple ritual. Every time she needed to study, she would light a very specific candle. That smell, that became the super obvious cue that signaled to her brain, okay, it's focus time now. All right, on to law 2, make it attractive. This is all about hacking the craving stage of the loop. And the strategy is brilliantly simple. You just pair something you have to do with something you want to do. This is textbook positive reinforcement. He calls it temptation bundling. Like maybe you only let yourself listen to your favorite true crime podcast when you're at the gym. Suddenly, that pleasure gets tangled up with the workout, and you actually start to crave the whole routine. Next, law 3, make it easy. This one is huge. It's all about reducing friction. You know why we fail so often? We try to do too much at once. We try to climb the whole mountain in one go. But the science is clear. The secret is to make the first step so small and easy that you can't possibly say no. And this is exactly what worked for Sophia. She didn't force herself to read a whole chapter. Nope. Her goal was just one single paragraph a night. That's it. The act of starting became so ridiculously easy, it was harder to avoid it than to just do it. And this whole start small thing isn't just a cute life hack. It's a real scientific principle called behavioral shaping. It's literally how animal trainers teach dolphins to do amazing flips. They reward the tiny steps along the way, and we can use that exact same process on ourselves. And that brings us to the final law, law 4, make it satisfying. A habit has to feel good. It has to deliver a reward. Our brains are wired for right now gratification. So if the real payoff, like getting an A, is weeks away, we have to create a little immediate win for ourselves. So for Sophia, what was her reward? Simple. After she read her 1 paragraph, she'd let herself take a quick 5-minute walk outside. That immediate little hit of satisfaction is what actually rewired her brain to want to do it again the next day and the day after that. So, okay, you put all 4 of these laws together, right? Make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. What you get is one of the biggest takeaways from both James Clear and, way back when, B.F. Skinner. The behaviorists figured this out a long time ago. That quote from Skinner, when he talks about arranging contingencies, that's just a fancy way of saying, change your environment so the good choice is the easy choice. And that's the thing, both of them agree. A disciplined person doesn't have some superhuman willpower. They're just smarter about designing an environment that does most of the hard work for them. So really the big lesson here is to stop trying to force change with brute force. Stop white-knuckling it. Instead, think of yourself as an architect of your own behavior. Your job is to redesign your space, your room, your phone, your computer, so that the good habits are just the easiest, most natural things to do.
And this all builds up to what might be the most powerful idea in the whole book. When you start shaping your environment, when you start celebrating those tiny little wins, you're doing something way more profound than just following tips from a book. You are actively practicing the real, proven science of how to change yourself. And this is where it gets really deep. It's the shift to what he calls identity-based habits. The goal isn't just to read more to get a good grade. The goal becomes to be a reader. The reward isn't the outcome anymore. The reward is the feeling you get from being the kind of person you want to be. It's about your identity. So let me leave you with this question. Just for a second, forget all about motivation, forget willpower. What's one tiny, obvious, ridiculously easy habit you could design into your life, starting right now, to take that first step toward becoming the person you really want to be?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open the code behind every single one of your habits. The good ones, the bad ones, and definitely the ones you want to change. We're going to dive into the amazing work of Charles Duhigg to show you exactly how you can get back in the driver's seat, one habit at a time.
So let's just kick things off with a big question for you. I want you to think about your day so far. How many of your actions, from the moment you grabbed your phone this morning to how you brewed your coffee, were actual conscious choices? And how many were just you on autopilot? Yeah, the answer is probably a little bit shocking.
To really get a grip on the power of this autopilot, we've got to look at the incredible story of a man named Eugene Pauly. His case literally turned what scientists thought they knew about our daily routines completely upside down.
Okay, so imagine this. After a really bad brain infection, Eugene's short-term memory was just gone. He couldn't tell you his doctor's name, he couldn't draw you a map of his own house, he couldn't even remember what he just ate for breakfast. He was basically living his life in 30-second increments.
But here's where it gets really weird. Even though he couldn't map out his own home, Eugene could get up, walk to the kitchen, and grab a snack without a problem. He could even take his daily walk around the block and find his way home, perfectly. If you asked him how he did it, he'd just shrug. His body just knew. And this is the mind-blowing part. Scientists figured out that his habits weren't being stored with his conscious memories at all. Nope. They were running from this deep, almost primitive part of his brain called the basal ganglia. It was like a secret autopilot, humming along perfectly even when the main cockpit was dark.
So, Eugene's story shows us there's this incredibly powerful system running in the background of our lives. So here's our game plan. First, we're going to decode the simple loop that drives that autopilot. Then, we'll get into the golden rule for changing any habit you want. After that, we'll see why belief and community are so critical. And finally, we'll tie it all together so you can start making real changes.
All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts. How does this autopilot in our brain actually work? What's the code that's running all of our automatic behaviors? Well, it turns out it's a beautifully simple three-step process.
It all boils down to this, a three-part pattern called the habit loop. First up, you have the cue. That's the trigger that tells your brain to flip the switch and go into auto mode. That kicks off the routine, which is the action itself. And then finally, you get the reward, which is what tells your brain, hey, that felt good. Let's remember this whole sequence for next time.
You see, your brain is all about efficiency. It's kind of lazy, but in a smart way. To save mental energy, it uses a process called chunking. It takes that whole sequence, cue, routine, reward, and bundles it into a single automatic action. That's exactly why you can back your car out of the driveway while you're totally lost in thought about your day. The whole thing has been chunked.
Okay, so this brings us to the question you've probably been waiting for. If these habits are burned so deep into our brains, can we actually get rid of the bad ones? Well, the science says, not really. You can't just delete a habit. But, and this is a big but, you can redesign it.
And that brings us to the golden rule, the single most important idea for changing a habit. Here it is. You keep the same old cue, and you aim for the same reward. But you have to consciously swap in a new routine. You're not trying to fight the old habit, you're actually hijacking the loop itself.
Let's make this super clear with a quick example. Meet Alina. Her cue was sitting down at her desk to study. That cue would immediately trigger her routine, scrolling on her phone. And the reward? A quick, easy hit of distraction. So to change it, she kept the cue, sitting at the desk, but she swapped the routine. Instead of grabbing her phone, she put on a study playlist. Then she gave herself a similar kind of reward,
a quick chat with friends. See? Same cue, similar reward, but a totally different routine. That is the secret sauce. Now, it's also really important to know that not all habits are created equal. Some are what Duhigg calls keystone habits. Think of these as the big dominoes. When you change one of them, it sets off this positive chain reaction, creating a bunch of other good habits almost automatically.
Exercise is the classic example. For so many people, just starting a regular workout routine, that's the keystone habit, starts this amazing ripple effect. All of a sudden, they start eating better, they sleep more deeply, they're more productive at work, and they do all this without even trying to focus on those other things. It's the one habit that just builds momentum everywhere else.
But you know, sometimes, especially when life gets stressful, just messing with the mechanics of the loop isn't quite enough to make a new habit stick for good. You need something more. You need a force multiplier.
This is precisely why groups like Alcoholics Anonymous are so incredibly successful. Yeah, they give people new routines for old cues, but they also add two game-changing ingredients: a community of people who get it, and a structure that helps you actually truly believe that change is possible for you.
Let's think about Marcus, a student who is bombing his quizzes because of test anxiety. He created a new study loop, sure, but the real breakthrough happened when he started leaning on his friends for encouragement and support.
And here's the magic. His reward system got a major upgrade. It wasn't just about the personal satisfaction of knowing the material. The reward became a 2-for-1 deal. He got that feeling of achievement, plus he got that powerful feeling of belonging and reinforcement from his friends. That combo is what makes a new habit almost unbreakable.
So, let's zoom all the way out. What's the big picture here, and what does this really mean for you? Well, it means you now have the tools to become a scientist of your own life.
Look, this whole framework is ridiculously powerful because it's so practical and hands-on. But we've got to be real here. It's a tool, not a magic wand. It's not going to be the fix for deep-seated trauma or huge systemic problems. Its power comes from you consciously choosing to use it.
And that really brings us to the most important thing I want you to take away from all this. The first step to changing any habit isn't about gritting your teeth and using willpower. It's awareness. That's it. The second you can actually see the loop, the cue, the routine, the reward, playing out in your life, that's the moment you get the power to step in and change it.
And let me just leave you with this one last powerful thought. So many of us think we have to wait for motivation to strike before we can do something new. But the science shows we've got it completely backward. You don't wait to feel inspired. You act first, even in a tiny way, and that action is what creates the inspiration.
So there you have it. You've got the blueprint now. You know about the loop, you know the golden rule of change, and you know how important belief is. So the only real question left is this: what's the first habit loop you're going to choose to redesign?
All right, today we're diving into one of the most powerful, most practical tools in all of modern psychology. It's called cognitive behavioral theory, or CBT, and honestly, it's an idea that has totally changed the game when it comes to understanding the link between our inner world and our outer reality.
I mean, you know the feeling, right? When your own mind feels like your worst enemy, just spinning these stories that lead to anxiety or sadness or just paralysis. Well, CBT tackles this exact problem head on. It suggests the key to breaking free isn't about changing the world around you, but about changing the very lens you use to see it.
So, to make this real, let's meet Lena. She's got this big presentation coming up, but her hands are shaking, her mind is just racing. And it all boils down to this one single, incredibly powerful thought: everyone will laugh at me. Now, that's not just some random idea floating by. Oh no, it's a trigger. It's the first domino that sets off a whole chain reaction. And this, right here, is the absolute heart of CBT. It's this revolutionary idea that says, hey, we aren't actually disturbed by what happens to us. We're disturbed by our beliefs about what happens. So for Lena, the presentation itself, that's not the problem. Her belief about the presentation, that's the problem. Okay, so let's put a formal definition on it. CBT is a model that basically sees our minds as this interconnected system. Your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, they're not living on separate islands. They are constantly talking to each other, constantly influencing each other. It's this dynamic, nonstop feedback loop. If you want to change one, you've got to engage the others. And here's that loop in action. People often call it the vicious cycle or the cognitive triangle. For Lena, it starts with the thought, everyone will laugh at me. That thought directly causes the feeling of intense anxiety, maybe even panic. And what does that awful feeling lead to? The behavior. She avoids the presentation altogether. But here's the kicker. That avoidance just reinforces her original thought that she couldn't handle it. See? She's completely trapped in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now, an idea this big didn't just pop up out of thin air. It was actually a massive shift in psychology. For a long time, the focus was all on external stuff, but CBT turned everything inward, to the workings of the mind. So let's meet the thinkers who really led this cognitive revolution. So for decades, psychology was dominated by two big things. First, Freudian psychoanalysis, which was all about digging into your distant past. And then by behaviorism, which basically said, I don't care what you're thinking, I only care about what you do. But then the 60s came along and everything changed. Pioneers like Albert Ellis and Aaron Beck started saying, wait a minute, you can't just ignore what's happening inside someone's head right now. And their work eventually merged to become the powerful therapy we know today as CBT. What's so fascinating is how these two pioneers had such different styles. Albert Ellis was really direct. He sometimes called his approach therapeutic tough love, basically pushing his clients to logically fight back against their irrational beliefs. Aaron Beck, on the other hand, was more of a collaborator. He saw negative thoughts not as irrational things to be argued with, but as little hypotheses, ideas that needed to be tested with evidence, just like a scientist in a lab. So let's look at what they built. Let's open up the CBT toolkit, because that's what it is, a set of practical tools. It gives us a whole new vocabulary to identify and work with our own mental patterns, which empowers you to become your very own mental detective. The first tool in the box is understanding automatic thoughts. These are those lightning-fast judgments that just pop into your head. Lena's "everyone will laugh at me" is a perfect example. They happen so fast and they feel so true that we often don't even notice we're having them. But man, do they have a massive impact on our emotions. And when these automatic thoughts start following the same unhelpful patterns over and over again, we call them cognitive distortions. The best way to think of these is like faulty filters on reality. They're like funhouse mirrors for your mind, mental habits that consistently twist your thinking, making you see everything in a much more negative light than it really is. And here are some of the greatest hits of these thought traps. You've got catastrophizing. That's turning a tiny setback into an absolute end-of-the-world disaster. There's black and white thinking, where things are either perfect or a total failure, with zero room for anything in between. And a big one is mind reading, where you just assume you know what other people are thinking, and it's usually something negative about you. Any of these sound a little familiar? So what do we do about these distortions? Well, this is where the real work begins. It's a core technique called cognitive restructuring. And notice that word restructuring. This is an active process. It's about learning to catch those automatic thoughts, put them on trial, question the evidence, and then consciously choose to replace them with thoughts that are more balanced and actually grounded in reality. Now, the reason we're even talking about CBT is because this toolkit isn't just some niche academic theory. It has become one of the most researched, most effective approaches in all of mental health, and its impact has spread far, far beyond the therapist's office. I mean, the evidence is just overwhelming. Study after study has shown that CBT is a highly effective treatment for some of the most common challenges people face, from depression and a whole range of anxiety disorders to OCD and even helping people process trauma. Let's see how that works with something as heavy as trauma. Take Carlos, a veteran who is just haunted by the automatic thought, I should have saved my friend. That single thought fuels so much guilt, so many nightmares. Now, CBT doesn't erase the memory. It can't, but it helps him challenge that self-blaming thought, to really examine the reality of that situation, and ultimately to transform the meaning he attaches to that incredibly painful event. But of course, no single approach is perfect for everyone, right? CBT's biggest strengths are that it's proven, it's practical, and it's incredibly empowering for clients. But critics do point out that it can sometimes feel a bit mechanical or formulaic, and its intense focus on thoughts might not be enough for really deep, complex trauma. Plus, it was developed in a Western context, so sometimes it needs to be adapted for different cultures. But here's the cool thing. CBT isn't static. It's always evolving. To deal with these very criticisms, modern approaches have started to integrate things like mindfulness to help people sit with overwhelming emotions, and even compassion-focused techniques. It's a sign of a healthy field. It's always adapting to become more holistic and more sensitive. So, after all that, what's the big takeaway here? What does this all boil down to? It's one word: empowerment.
The real goal of CBT isn't to keep you in therapy forever. It's to give you the skills to become your own therapist. Ultimately, what CBT teaches you is to treat your thoughts not as undeniable facts, but as hypotheses that need to be tested. And that is a skill that lasts a lifetime. It's the ability to pause, catch that thought that says, I can't do it, and ask yourself, okay, is that a fact or is that just my fear talking? Really, the entire philosophy is captured in this simple idea. You can learn to think differently, and when your thinking changes, your world begins to change with it. It's a psychology of hope, but it's a hope that's grounded in practical, real-world action. You change your perception, and you actually start to change your experience of the world. And so that leaves us with one final question. For you, think about some nagging, automatic thought that might be holding you back in some small way. What is just one thought that you could choose to question today? Today, we're going to dive into something called applied behavior analysis, or ABA for short. Now, this is a really powerful science for getting to the bottom of why we do the things we do, and maybe more importantly, how we can actually change our behaviors. But it's also a field with a pretty complex and honestly, an often misunderstood past. I mean, we've all been there, right? You've got that one habit you just can't seem to shake, or that new good habit you want to start, but it just won't stick. Well, applied behavior analysis gives us a scientific lens to figure out why. It helps us see the hidden forces that are quietly guiding our actions every single day. So where did all of this even come from? To really get a handle on ABA, we've got to go back to the very beginning. And that's not in a therapist's office, but actually in the super-controlled environment of a science lab. You know, the whole mission of ABA's pioneers was, well, it was incredibly ambitious. They truly believed that the exact same scientific laws that could explain why a pigeon pecks at a little key could also explain something as complex as why a child learns to talk or how an adult can finally kick a bad habit. It was all about taking these proven principles and using them to make human lives better. And this big idea really comes from one pivotal figure, B.F. Skinner, over at Harvard. He came up with a concept that sounds so simple, but it was revolutionary. Behavior is shaped by its consequences. In other words, whatever happens right after you do something is what determines whether you're going to do it again. That one idea, it became the foundation for literally everything that followed. And this core concept has a name, operant conditioning. It's basically the engine that drives all of ABA. And it's shockingly simple, really. When a behavior is followed by something good, we call that a reinforcement, we're much more likely to do it again. But if it's followed by something negative, well, we're less likely to repeat it. That's the basic loop. Okay, so how exactly did a principle they were observing in pigeons make the massive leap to helping people with really complex, real-world challenges? Well, that journey from the lab to real life, it happened over a couple of really key decades. It all kicked off in 1953, when Skinner basically put the idea out there. And pretty soon after, researchers like Baer, Wolf, and Risley started trying to apply these concepts to human behavior. All of that work eventually led to this groundbreaking paper in 1968, which is what formally established applied behavior analysis and gave it a really clear identity. So this 1968 article basically laid out the ground rules. It defined ABA with 3 core dimensions. For something to be considered ABA, it had to be applied, meaning it had to solve real, socially significant problems. It had to be behavioral, focused only on actions you can actually see and measure. And finally, it had to be analytic. You needed data to prove that your intervention was the thing that actually worked. Now, any tool this powerful is bound to have some controversy. And ABA's history is absolutely no exception. In fact, its most well-known application is also its most debated one. Back in the 60s and 70s, a researcher at UCLA named Ivor Lovaas started using ABA to teach skills to children with autism. His studies reported some pretty dramatic successes, and that's what really brought ABA into the public eye. But his methods also raised some very serious ethical questions about things like compliance, conformity, and what the actual goals of the therapy should be. And this right here really shows you the critical evolution of the entire field. The early methods were often really rigid. They focused heavily on compliance, and sometimes they even used punishment. But in response to very valid criticism, especially from the autistic community, the field has shifted dramatically. Today, the focus is all about positive reinforcement, collaborating with the individual, and respecting their autonomy. So let me give you an example of how the modern approach might work.
Imagine a little boy named Ethan. The process for him might start with something like a token system, where he earns tokens for his favorite toy train. But here's the key. The real goal is to gradually fade out those external rewards. Why? So that the true reinforcement becomes the natural joy and connection that comes from communicating. It's about building motivation from the inside out, not just demanding compliance.
You know, the field also kind of evolved from within, splitting into two main streams. On one side, you have traditional behavior analysts who stuck really close to Skinner's original focus on observable actions. But then another group, the contextual behavior scientists, came along and argued that, hey, we also need to address our private events, our thoughts and feelings. They developed therapies like ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, which uses mindfulness to help build psychological flexibility, which is just a fancy way of saying the ability to keep moving toward your goals even when tough thoughts and emotions show up.
Okay, so let's bring this all back home, because ABA isn't just for therapy. Its principles are totally universal, and you can see them and actually use them in your own life every single day. Let's take Maria. She was just stuck, procrastinating. The immediate reward of scrolling on her phone was always winning out over that long-term goal of finishing her thesis. So she set up a simple system of reinforcement. For every 30 minutes of solid work, she got a 10-minute music break. And just like that, she changed the pattern and made progress the more rewarding choice. And you can use this exact same strategy. The whole process is a simple 3-step loop that you can apply to pretty much any goal you have, whether it's studying for a test, being more productive at work, or building a brand new habit. So here's the simple loop. First, you have to be super specific about your goal. Don't just say, I'm going to study more. No, say, I am going to read 10 pages. Second, pick a reward that you actually want. And third, and this is the most important part, you have to give yourself that reward immediately after you do the work. That immediate feedback is what forges the connection in your brain.
And beyond that basic loop, there are other awesome tools from the ABA playbook. The first is shaping. If a goal just feels way too big, you break it into tiny little steps and reward each one. So instead of write a chapter, your goal becomes write 1 paragraph. Boom, rewarded. The second is stimulus control. This is where you design your environment to make the right behavior easier. A classic example is having a desk that is only for work. No social media, no snacks. When you sit there, your brain gets the cue, it's time to focus. And finally, there's generalization, which is all about making sure that new habit of yours actually sticks around in different situations.
Jamal's story is a perfect example of this. He started a journal just to get some extra credit in one class. That was his external reward. But he quickly discovered that the act of reflection itself was so valuable, so insightful, that he started using it to process ideas for his other classes, and even in his personal life. The skill generalized. It went from one specific context to many others because it became its own reward. So when you look at the whole journey, from its controversial past to all its practical applications today, what's the big takeaway here? I think it's that the science of behavior has really grown up. It's matured. Modern ABA is not about controlling people. It's about collaborating with them. Practitioners today really see themselves more like architects. They're helping to design environments where people can naturally find success, and it's all built on a foundation of dignity, consent, and what is truly meaningful to that individual. And despite all this history and all this complexity, when you boil it all down, it really comes back to one powerful central idea. And this is it. The simple idea that small, positive consequences delivered consistently are what build incredible results over time. It doesn't matter if it's a child learning to speak or you learning a new skill. Progress happens one reinforced step at a time. So knowing all this, the final question really isn't about ABA anymore. It's about you. Understanding the science of behavior gives you this incredible new lens to look at your own life. So what pattern will you choose to change? Have you ever met someone and just felt that instant spark? That chemistry? We love to think of it as some kind of magic, right? Like it's fate. But what if I told you it's something we can actually understand? Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the science of romantic attraction. And honestly, it might just change the way you think about love forever. So let's start with a kind of provocative question. What if that spark, that incredible pull you feel towards someone, isn't magic at all? What if it's just a habit? Something our brains have literally been trained to want, just like any other learned behavior. It's a wild idea, I know, but it completely reframes how we look at romance.
To really get this, we've got to step away from the poetry and dive into a little bit of psychology. The key to unlocking this whole mystery of the spark is in a field called behaviorism. And the big idea here is that even our most complex feelings, yeah, including love, are shaped by our experiences.
So what exactly is behaviorism? Well, at its core, it's pretty simple. It's the idea that we learn how to act. We do stuff, and if that stuff leads to a good outcome, a reward, we're way more likely to do it again. It's a basic rule, but it is incredibly powerful, and it secretly governs so much of our lives, including who we fall for. Now, when we talk about rewards in dating, we're not talking about fancy dinners or expensive gifts. Nope, the things that really reinforce attraction are much smaller day-to-day exchanges. Think about it, a compliment that makes you feel really seen, someone's undivided attention, a shared laugh, a simple touch on the arm. Each one of those is like a tiny reward that trains our brain to associate that person with feeling good. Okay, so how does this actually look in the real world? Let's zoom in on a classic setting where these attraction habits often get wired in for the first time, the college dating scene. And to make this super clear, let's follow the story of Emma and Ryan. They're just two students who happen to be in the same stats class. And their little budding romance, it's basically a perfect case study of behaviorism in action. And this right here shows you the feedback loop perfectly. So Ryan cracks a joke, that's the behavior. Emma laughs, boom, that's the reward. That reward makes Ryan think, hey, that worked, and he's more likely to engage with her again. At the same time, Emma is being rewarded by his attention and his humor. Every little interaction conditions them to want the next one, and that's what they start to feel as that magical chemistry. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe a little messy. The rewards aren't always consistent, are they? What happens when someone gives you tons of attention one day, and then they're totally distant the next? Well, behaviorism has a fascinating and maybe slightly unsettling explanation for why that can be so captivating. This is something called a variable reinforcement schedule, and the easiest way to get it is to just think of a slot machine. You keep pulling that lever, right? Over and over. Why? Because you never know when the payout is going to come. You just know it could come. That unpredictability is exactly what keeps you hooked. The exact same logic applies to a person who gives you unpredictable attention. And this is the real kicker, that constant wondering, do they like me? Are they going to text back? It creates this incredibly powerful emotional pull. The inconsistency isn't a problem, it's a feature that makes the connection feel so much more intense, so much more urgent, even when it's not healthy. The uncertainty itself literally becomes addictive. So, does this mean we're just stuck with these patterns forever once we learn them? Not at all. Let's fast forward a bit and see how these same rules play out later in life. Because the good news is, our habits around love are not set in stone. We can absolutely unlearn old patterns and relearn new, healthier ones, no matter how old we are. So let's take a look at Robert. He's 55, recently divorced, and, the habits he built up over a long marriage just aren't really working for him in the dating world today. He's learned to be kind of anxious and closed off. But his story is proof that change is totally possible. What we find rewarding in a partner also changes over time. When we're younger, we might be drawn to that whole roller coaster of inconsistent attention. But as we get older, a lot of us start to prioritize things like stability and consistent emotional rewards. The rules of behaviorism are the same, but the rewards we're looking for have totally evolved. So for Robert, this meant he had to take some small risks. Instead of being guarded, he might try sharing a real thought or a feeling on a date. And when his dates responded with warmth and understanding, that's the positive reinforcement, it literally started to rewire his brain. He was learning a brand new behavior, that being vulnerable doesn't lead to rejection, it actually leads to connection. All right, you knew it was coming. We can't talk about modern dating without talking about the apps. And it turns out the companies that make these things are absolute masters of behaviorism. They use it to design platforms that are, let's be honest, almost impossible to put down. Dating apps are basically modern-day Skinner boxes that you carry around in your pocket. Seriously, every swipe is a lever pull. A match, a like, a new message, those are the unpredictable rewards. Those little notifications are designed to give you a tiny dopamine hit, reinforcing the habit of checking the app again and again. They are built on the exact same principles that make slot machines so addictive. Okay, so hearing all this might make love sound a bit calculated, but here's the flip side, and I think it's actually incredibly empowering. If love is learned, it means we have some control.
It means we can be intentional about the behaviors we reward in ourselves and in our partners. We can literally learn how to build a better relationship. And hey, this isn't just some fringe theory. It's a proven therapeutic technique. It's the whole idea behind behavioral couples therapy. It teaches couples to stop just waiting around for good feelings to happen and instead to actively create them by intentionally reinforcing the behaviors they want to see more of from each other. So, what does this look like in practice? The roadmap is actually pretty simple. It's all about small, conscious actions. Your partner really listens to you. You reward that by putting your phone down and giving them your full attention. They make a dumb joke, you laugh anyway. Each little action is like a small deposit into the relationship's bank of positive reinforcement. And that really is the biggest takeaway here. That spark, that connection, that affection that lasts, it's not something you just stumble upon, like finding a lucky penny. It's something you build. It's something you practice and you learn together through thousands and thousands of tiny reinforcing moments. So I'll leave you with this to think about. In every single one of your relationships, you're both a teacher and a student. So take a second to think about the lessons that you're teaching. Who are you teaching to love you? And just as important, what behaviors are you rewarding? Let's talk about Robert Greene's The 48 Laws of Power. You've probably heard of it. It is, without a doubt, one of the most controversial, most debated books on strategy ever written. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain and show you the hidden engine that makes these laws so unbelievably potent. So let's just get right to the heart of it with a big question. Is power an art? Some mysterious gift you're either born with or you're not. Or is it a science? Something with predictable rules and, more importantly, repeatable results? That question right there is the key to everything we're about to unlock. All right, let's start with the secret of power itself. What is it about Greene's tales of ancient courtiers and cunning manipulators that feels so timeless? And let's be honest, for a lot of people, so effective in our world today. I mean, the book is famous, or maybe infamous, for its cold, almost ruthless advice on getting ahead. But if you look past the shock value, you'll see there's a system at play. So the real puzzle isn't what the laws are, it's why they seem to work so reliably across so many centuries and so many different cultures. And here it is, the big reveal. The answer doesn't lie in history or philosophy or some kind of dark art. It's in psychology. Specifically, the science of behavior, which, as you're about to see, is basically the blueprint for almost every single law in Greene's book. The core idea is called behaviorism, and it's actually beautiful in its simplicity, but it is incredibly powerful. The theory is just this. What we do is shaped by what happens right after we do it. If an action gets you something good, a reward, you're probably going to do it again. If it leads to a bad outcome, a punishment, well, you'll stop. It is the basic operating system for how humans act. And this right here, this really nails the behaviorist point of view. It doesn't care about your secret feelings or your noble intentions. Power, from this perspective, isn't about your inner character. It's about your observable patterns. It's about what you actually do and how the world responds to it. All right, so now that we have this scientific key, let's start decoding some of Greene's most famous laws. And you're going to see they aren't just clever old proverbs. They are, in fact, practical applications of behavioral conditioning. Let's start with a classic. Law number 1, probably the most well-known of them all, never outshine the master. It sounds like simple, maybe even cynical advice for an ambitious courtier, but there is a very precise psychological mechanism at work here. And here's that principle in action. When you outshine your boss, you threaten their authority. That's a behavior that almost always gets punished, maybe subtly, like with a bad assignment or getting left out of a meeting. But when you make your master look good, that behavior gets reinforced with trust, praise, maybe even a promotion. See? Greene is just describing a learned behavioral pattern. Okay, but what about something a little more fuzzy? Like charisma. Greene talks about it like it's this powerful tool for influence. But where does it come from? Is it magic? Nope. Behaviorism actually gives us the schematics for how it's built. You've all heard of Pavlov's dogs, right? They salivated at the sound of a bell because they learned to associate it with food. Well, a charismatic person becomes a kind of social bell by consistently dishing out positive reinforcement, a compliment, genuine validation, a laugh at a joke.
They become associated with pleasure. We're literally drawn to them because our brains are conditioned to feel good in their presence.
And believe me, this principle is everywhere in the book. Just look at this breakdown. Court attention at all costs? Well, that works because your actions can't be reinforced if nobody sees them. Keep others in suspended terror? That's a textbook description of intermittent reinforcement, that unpredictable pattern of reward and punishment that creates the absolute strongest conditioning. It's the exact same psychological hook that makes slot machines so addictive.
Let's make this even more real with a quick story. So, you've got this student, Samantha. She likes to participate. In Professor A's class, whenever she speaks up, she gets smiles, she gets nods, she gets participation credit. That's positive reinforcement. So naturally, her behavior is reinforced, and she contributes more and more. But then, she walks into Professor B's class. She does the exact same behavior, speaks enthusiastically, but this time, it's met with a sigh, a subtle eye roll, maybe even a dismissive comment. That is punishment. And the result? Samantha quickly learns to just stay quiet. Her behavior totally changes. So here is the crucial point, the knockout punch of this whole idea. Was Samantha a confident student in one class and a shy one in the other? Of course not. Her character didn't change at all. Her behavior adapted to the system of rewards and punishments in her environment. This is the absolute core of behaviorism, and it's the engine driving all 48 of Green's laws. Now, you can see how this knowledge is incredibly powerful, and just like any real power, it can be used in two very, very different ways. This brings us to a really critical choice, the choice between manipulation and self-mastery. So you have two paths. You can take this understanding of conditioning and use it to engineer the behavior of other people for your own benefit. That is the dark path of manipulation and control. Or you can apply those exact same principles inward to engineer your own behavior. And that is the empowered path of self-control and mastery. When you go down that dark path, Green's laws become a toolkit for controlling people. Use selective honesty is just a variable reward schedule to keep someone guessing. Play to people's fantasies is nothing more than targeted positive reinforcement. And crush your enemy totally, that's an extreme form of punishment designed to wipe out a behavior for good. But look what happens when we flip the script and turn these laws inward, on ourselves. Plan all the way to the end becomes something called reinforcement chaining, breaking a huge goal into small, rewarded steps to build momentum. Conceal your intentions isn't about deceiving others anymore. It's about maintaining focus on your own habits without getting sidetracked. The laws of power become the laws of self-control. And this leads us to our final, and honestly, the most important takeaway from this entire breakdown. It completely reframes the whole idea of power, not as something you take from other people, but as something you build inside yourself. Because once you truly understand the science of behavior, you realize that the greatest power you will ever have is not the ability to shape and control the people around you. It's the ability to consciously design your own environment, your own habits, your own rewards, to become the person you actually want to be. Now that is true mastery. So, I'll leave you with this one question. Your behavior right now, today, is being shaped by the consequences and rewards in your environment. The only question is, are you just letting that environment condition you by default, or are you the one doing the designing?
You know those relationships that feel magnetic, almost addictive, even when they're totally chaotic? Ever wonder what's really going on behind the scenes? Well, today, we're pulling back the curtain on the psychological engineering that makes them tick. We're going to be talking about the unseen architect.
All right, so let's just dive right in with a big question, one that gets to the absolute heart of all this. Why? Why do we get so hooked on uncertainty? What is it about not knowing that feels so much more compelling than a sure thing?
And to get to the bottom of this, we're not going to just float around in theory. No, we're going to dig into a real-world clinical case study, the pretty fascinating and, well, complex social life of a woman known in the literature as Miss M.
Okay, get this. Miss NM had 12 different men on standby, just kind of orbiting her, waiting for a call. The big question here isn't just, why she did it. It's why in the world did they stay? And the answer? Well, it has nothing to do with romance. It's all about a really powerful form of conditioning.
And that brings us to our first section here, what we're calling the slot machine effect. Because believe it or not,
the exact same psychological hook that kept these 12 men on the line. It's the same thing that keeps a gambler glued to a slot machine, just pulling that lever over and over and over again.
So, the fancy clinical term for this is intermittent reinforcement. And look, don't get it twisted. This isn't just some random drama. It's a textbook case of one of the most powerful tools in all of behavioral science. Basically, just think of it as a system where the rewards, in this case her attention, her affection, they're handed out totally unpredictably. And it's that randomness, that's the secret sauce. That's what makes it so powerful.
And we can get even more specific. This whole thing runs on what's called a variable ratio schedule. All that means is the reward, the payout, it comes after a totally unknown number of tries. Maybe you get a text back after 1 try, or maybe it's after 10 or 20. It's this not knowing that creates the highest, most obsessive level of engagement you can imagine. It's the hope of the reward that becomes the real drug, not the reward itself.
And you can really see the difference when you put them side by side. A predictable reward, let's say a call every Friday at 5 p.m. Okay, that leads to a low, steady effort. You know it's coming, no big deal. But an unpredictable reward, oh man, that turns it into a high-stakes game. The result is this frantic, persistent, almost desperate kind of effort. And that's the engine driving this whole system.
So, okay, how does the system actually play out in the real world? Let's get into our next section and look at how this conditioning doesn't just keep people hanging around, it actively trains them to act in very specific ways. These are, essentially, the rules of the game.
And this is not happening by accident. It's basically a 3-step conditioning program. Step 1, it trains the target to respond instantly, like drop everything. Step 2, it trains them to become the perfect, compliant listener, always available. And step 3, well, over time, it can create a state of learned helplessness, where they feel completely powerless to change anything.
So what's the big prize they're working so hard for? It's that unpredictable gift of attention. The source material has a perfect name for it, the love bomb. It's this rare but incredibly intense burst of affection and validation that just wipes the slate clean. It makes them feel like all their effort was worth it, and it gets them right back to chasing that next hit.
All right, so we've covered the how, we see the mechanics, but that leads to the really big question, why? Why would someone like our Miss NM feel the need to build this kind of complicated social fortress around herself? To get that, we need to look at the architect's blueprint, the deep psychological drivers that are powering this whole thing.
The source material really zeroes in on 2 core motivations that are working together here. The first is something called vulnerable narcissism. Now, this isn't your classic chest-thumping narcissist. This is about having a really fragile sense of self that needs a constant drip feed of external validation just to feel okay. You can see how 12 men would be a pretty good source for that. The second driver is borderline personality disorder, which, at its heart, is often defined by this deep, overwhelming fear of being abandoned.
And there's a quote from the analysis that just nails it. The 12 men act as a massive safety net. I mean, just think about that for a second. If one of them starts to pull away or gets tired, who cares? The loss is barely a blip on the radar. The architect can just shift her focus to one of the other 11, making sure she is never ever left alone or has to face rejection.
And this brings us to the most crucial point. If this whole dynamic is so clearly manipulative, why is it so incredibly hard to just walk away? In our last section, we're going to look at why breaking the cycle is so tough and what the clinical solution actually is.
Well, the reason it's so hard to escape actually has a name. It's called the partial reinforcement extinction effect, or PREE for short. And it's a totally counterintuitive but really powerful idea. Behaviors that are rewarded unpredictably are way more resistant to being unlearned than behaviors that were rewarded every single time.
So here's the bottom line. The system itself has trained these men to think that long periods of silence are normal. When the architect goes dark for a week, it doesn't register as a breakup. It just feels like a normal part of the game. The expected delay before the next big win. The silence isn't the end. It's just a pause.
So, because this behavior is so deeply wired in, so resilient, trying to fix it with half measures, it's just not going to work. The only way to break the conditioning is a complete, total system shutdown.
And that shutdown has a clinical term too, an extinction procedure. What does that mean? It means you cut all contact, not slowly, immediately, and not for a little while, but permanently. It is the only way to finally force the brain to accept that the slot machine is broken. It's never, ever going to pay out again.
So there you have it. We've taken apart the blueprint of the unseen architect. We've seen how this thing called intermittent reinforcement can shape our behavior with almost surgical precision. And it really just leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Now that you can see the strings, can you spot the architect in the world around you?
Have you ever stopped and wondered why you suddenly feel a rush of excitement, or a wave of calm, or that sharp, familiar sting of stress? Well, it's not just all in your head. It's actually a silent, non-stop conversation happening inside your body, and it's written in the language of chemistry. So let's dive in and decode this hidden dialogue that shapes your every single move.
This quote, wow, it really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Behind every decision you make, every single feeling that washes over you, there's this incredible cascade of tiny molecules. We're talking hormones and neurotransmitters, and they're all whispering instructions between your cells. It's this amazing blend of the mental and the molecular. I mean, think about it. If we can learn to speak this chemical language, we can start to understand ourselves on a much, much deeper level. It's not just about what you feel, but why you feel it.
Okay, so we're going to pull back the curtain on this whole internal conversation. It's really a story about how our biology creates our behavior, and it's a story that scientists have been piecing together for over 100 years.
You know, this understanding didn't just happen overnight. It really started way back with scientists just noticing these messengers coming from our glands, which of course we now call hormones. Then a little later, we found the brain's own super fast chemical messaging system, the neurotransmitters. But the real game changer, the big aha moment, was realizing these aren't two separate systems. No way. They're one giant integrated network that literally builds our entire experience of life.
Right, so to really get a handle on this network, we have to go to the source. Let's head to the command center in your brain where this whole show kicks off. And here it is. Meet the hypothalamus. It is tiny, but don't let its size fool you. It's one of the most powerful parts of your entire brain. Just think of it as the ultimate translator. It takes everything happening around you, a stressful email, a nice compliment, a scary movie, and it translates that experience into chemical orders for your entire body. Pretty incredible, right?
And it all happens in this amazing cascade effect. So first, your hypothalamus senses some kind of trigger. Then, boom, it sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which is kind of like the body's master gland. From there, the pituitary directs other glands to get to work. And finally, those glands release hormones into your system. And that's the moment you feel it. Your heart pounds, your palms get sweaty, or maybe you feel a warm glow. A single thought can create a full-body response in just seconds. All right, let's talk about a feeling we all know, maybe a little too well, stress. This whole fight or flight response is probably one of the most powerful examples of our internal chemistry in action.
So when your brain perceives a threat, your body starts mixing this potent chemical cocktail. First up, you get a shot of adrenaline. That's that immediate jolt, right? It gets your heart racing and preps you for action, now. Then comes cortisol. Think of it as the follow-up. It's not for the initial sprint. It's the fuel that's going to keep you alert and focused for the long haul of dealing with whatever's stressing you out.
But here's the thing you absolutely have to know about cortisol. It is a total double-edged sword. In the short term, it's your best friend. Seriously, it sharpens your mind, boasts your memory, and helps you survive. But when that stress becomes chronic, when that cortisol tap is just always on, it turns against you. It can weaken your immune system, fog up your thinking, and lead straight to burnout. The very same chemical that can save your life can also completely wear you down. All right, that's enough about stress. Let's flip the script and look at the other side of the coin, the really fun stuff. The incredible chemistry that creates feelings of happiness, connection, and pure joy. Okay, here we have the feel-good trio. First, you've got serotonin. This is your mood stabilizer. It gives you that feeling of calm contentment, like enjoying a quiet morning with a cup of coffee. Then there's dopamine, which is totally different. That's the thrill of the chase, that rush you get when you're working towards something or you achieve a goal. And then you have oxytocin, often called the love hormone, which creates those amazing feelings of warmth and trust when you really connect with people. Each one gives you a totally different flavor of happiness. Let's just focus on dopamine for a second, because this is so interesting. Calling it biological currency is just perfect. Your brain releases it as a reward to reinforce behaviors it wants you to do again. That little buzz you get from a like on social media or from finishing a big project, that's dopamine hitting your brain and saying, hey, that was good. Let's do that again. And that brings us to oxytocin. This quote just captures its magic so perfectly. It really is the chemistry of connection. When it's released, like during a hug or a deep conversation, it literally teaches our nervous system that being close to other people is safe, it's rewarding, it's good for us. It's the biochemical reason why a simple hug can feel so incredibly comforting. So, up to this point, we've seen how chemistry pretty much runs the show, right? How it shapes our minds. But what if I told you it's not a one-way street? This is where things get really, really empowering. So, we've established this part, right? Low serotonin can lead to feelings of sadness. A big surge of adrenaline creates that feeling of fear. Our chemistry basically sets the stage for our mental state. But here it is. This is the big twist. You are not just a passenger on this chemical ride. Your actions, your thoughts, your beliefs, they can actively change the chemical cocktail in your brain. You actually have agency here. And here's the proof. Just look at these simple, totally doable things. Feeling stressed out? A few minutes of deep breathing can literally lower your cortisol levels. Need a mood lift? Go for a walk, get some exercise. That'll give you a great dopamine boost. Feeling a little disconnected? Do a small act of kindness for someone. That releases oxytocin. You really are the co-author of your own internal story. You can pick up the pen and change the narrative anytime you want. So let's bring this all home. What we've really been exploring here is this profound, totally inseparable partnership between our physical biology and our mental beliefs. At its very core, this is the material truth of it. Our conscious experience, what we call our mind, is the product of the brain's activity. And all that activity, it's fundamentally a series of chemical reactions. And this, right here, is the ultimate takeaway. It's not just that biology creates belief. Belief then feeds back and changes our biology. It is a continuous self-reinforcing loop. The story you tell yourself about the world actually changes your chemistry, and then that new chemistry reinforces the very story you're telling. They are completely and totally intertwined. So the final question is really for you. Knowing all this, knowing that you're an active participant in this conversation, that your thoughts and your actions can literally steer your own chemistry, how are you going to manage that inner dialogue tomorrow? What will you do to co-author a better story for yourself? All right, let's talk about the incredible, invisible orchestra of molecules that's pretty much creating the soundtrack to our lives. We're calling it the chemistry of you. Ever had one of those days where you feel like you can conquer the world, and then the next day just getting out of bed feels like a huge ask? Or maybe you know that feeling, your heart starts pounding right before a big presentation? We've all been there. It's like this internal weather system that just does its own thing. Well, guess what? It turns out your mood does kind of have a mind of its own. Or maybe a better way to put it is that it has its own language. And no, I'm not talking about words. I'm talking about a language of chemistry, a constant conversation of molecules and signals happening deep inside your brain. And that's exactly what we're going to get into. So where do we even start with decoding this secret language? Well, we've got to go back to the science that first cracked the code. And that science is biochemistry. Now, don't let the name fool you. This is so much more than just test tubes and lab coats. Really, think of it as the ultimate bridge. It's what connects the physical thing in your head, that 3-pound organ, to the totally invisible world of your thoughts, your feelings, your consciousness. And the sheer scale of this, it's just mind-blowing. Your brain has something like 86 billion neurons. I mean, to put that into perspective, that's more than 10 times the number of people on the entire planet. And every single one of them is part of this huge chattering network, all talking to each other using that chemical language we're about to dive into. You know, we didn't just figure this out overnight. It was a slow process, built piece by piece. There's this incredible story from 1921 where a scientist named Otto Loewy proved that nerves actually talk using chemicals. He did this brilliant experiment with frog hearts, of all things, and discovered what he called vagus stuff, which turned out to be the very first neurotransmitter ever identified. That discovery, and then finding key players like dopamine and serotonin in the 50s, that's when we really started to pull back the curtain on this whole secret chemical symphony. Okay, so now that we've got some of the history down, let's meet the stars of the show. Think of these chemicals as the managers of your mind. First up, dopamine. You can think of this as your brain's gas pedal. And it's not just about feeling pleasure. It's the little voice in your head that says, hey, that was good, let's do that again. It's literally the driving force behind our goals, our desires, pretty much everything we do.
So, dopamine wears a lot of different hats. It's what gives you that little rush of reward when you finish a tough workout, or even just check something off your to-do list. And that signal reinforces the behavior, right? It creates this powerful pattern we call a dopamine loop. Now, you can use this loop for good, like building great habits. But it can also be hijacked by things like those endless social media notifications that keep us scrolling for hours.
But here's the really crucial part. With these chemicals, balance is everything. If you have too little dopamine, the world can feel flat, you know? Your motivation just tanks. That deficit is actually what's behind the tremors in Parkinson's disease. And on the flip side, if you have way too much dopamine activity, well, that's been linked to psychosis, where your brain's whole perception of reality gets distorted. It's a total chemical tightrope.
Okay, let's bring in our next player. If dopamine is the engine, think of serotonin as the suspension system. It's not about creating those big highs, it's about smoothing out all the bumps in the road. It's the brain's master mood stabilizer. Serotonin is kind of like a quiet conductor, you know? It's subtly influencing basically everything, from your emotional balance to how well you sleep, and even your appetite. When your serotonin levels are balanced, you generally feel calm, content, but when they get too low, that can open the door to things like depression and anxiety. And that's exactly why it's such a huge focus in mental health.
Right, so it's super important to remember that none of these chemicals work in a vacuum. They're all part of this super complex, dynamic system of checks and balances. It's like a nonstop conversation happening inside your head. And this slide shows the most fundamental balance of all, the brain's main on and off switches. You've got glutamate, which is the go signal. It gets the neurons all fired up and fuels things like learning and memory. But obviously, you can't have the gas pedal to the floor 24/7. That's where GABA comes in. It's the stop signal. Almost every single moment you're awake, these two are in this delicate tug of war. GABA is the calming force that keeps the whole system from overheating and spinning out into anxiety. And what's so wild is that because we're starting to understand this language, we can actually interact with it. We can use things called agonists, think of morphine, that basically mimic or enhance a natural signal to do something like reduce pain. And then there are antagonists, like naloxone, which do the opposite. They block a signal. In the case of naloxone, it's used to reverse an opioid overdose. It's pretty amazing. It's like we've figured out how to turn the volume up or down on these specific chemical conversations. And of course, we can't forget the supporting players who end up having these huge roles in our social lives. I'm talking about oxytocin. You've probably heard it called the bonding molecule or the cuddle hormone. It gets released during moments of real connection. A hug, a great conversation, even just working on a team with people you like. It's basically a social glue. It deepens trust, it builds empathy. It really is the chemistry of we.
Okay, so this is all really fascinating theory, right? But how does it actually play out in real life? Let's walk through a couple of examples to see it in action.
All right, first, let's revisit those antidepressants we talked about, SSRIs. So how do they actually work? Well, imagine one of your brain cells sends out a little bit of serotonin to deliver a message. Normally, it gets sent out and then quickly sucked back in. That's called reuptake. What an SSRI does is it basically stands in front of the reentry door and blocks it. This leaves the serotonin floating around for longer, which gives it more time to deliver its calming, mood-stabilizing message. It just strengthens the signal that's already there. Okay, now for a real-world story, let's see all these chemicals in action. This is Lena. She has a huge exam coming up that she needs to study for. The second she starts thinking about it, that feeling of pressure triggers the release of stress hormones. We're talking cortisol and adrenaline. Her heart starts beating faster, her palms get a little sweaty. Yep, that's the chemical signature of anxiety kicking in. But Lena gets to it. She starts studying. And as she starts to figure out a tough concept or solves a practice problem, bam, her brain gives her a little hit of dopamine. That's the motivation engine we talked about. It feels good, so it reinforces her focus and keeps her going. She's literally turning that anxious energy into productive fuel. And then her friend shows up with a coffee and says, "You got this." That simple moment of social support, it triggers a release of oxytocin, that bonding molecule. It instantly starts to calm her stress response and makes her feel connected, like she's not in this alone. So, just in the span of an hour, Lena's brain has gone through this whole cascade of chemical changes. So, when you kind of zoom out from all the details, you start to realize that understanding this language does more than just explain how things work. It actually changes how we see ourselves.
And I really want to leave you with this idea. These molecules aren't just abstract chemicals. Dopamine, that's the thrill of figuring something out. Serotonin is that feeling of calm after a stressful day. Oxytocin is the warmth you feel from a hug. See, they aren't some foreign substances controlling you from the inside. They are you. They're the physical expression of your experience. Learning this chemical language gives you a totally new way to listen to your own body, to your own mind. It doesn't make your experiences smaller or less meaningful, it makes them richer. So I'll leave you with this. If chemistry is the language, what story is your brain telling you today?